Good morning, everyone. I'm Ashford Chancellor. I'm the practice manager for VCFO in the North Texas region. Thanks for attending our crisis strategy webinar as the first of a four-part webinar series. We're going to give everybody another couple of minutes to log on, and then we'll start. Okay, once again, thanks everyone. We have got a very thought-provoking webinar coming up for you with a lot of content, a lot of information. But before we start, let's do some introductions, and then we'll do some background, and then we'll jump into the meat of the program. So as I said before, I'm Ashford Chancellor. I'm the practice manager for the VCFO North Texas region. VCFO is a financial consulting firm that offers a fractional CFO, controller, assistant controller, HR, and recruiting solutions for small to medium-sized businesses. In our 25-year history, we've served over 5,000 clients, anywhere from startups in the early stages to companies with hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. You can see on the screen there's my background. I've spent 30 years as a CFO. I've covered the spectrum, worked in Big Four accounting at the beginning of my career, also for-profit, nonprofit, typical manufacturing, energy, technology sectors. There's a lot of words on there, but one of the things that might be more applicable to this day and time is that when I was in Washington, D.C., about 10 years ago, working for a scientific or an organization that did research into the life sciences. And one of our parts of our portfolio was epidemics and pandemics. So I worked alongside with a lot of epidemiologists, was with them during 2 worldwide epidemics. And so that gave me a good background for understanding as this pandemic unfolded last year. I had a good background for understanding what was about to happen. But before we start, I also want to let my co-presenter, Ed Riefenstahl, introduce himself. Ed?
Ashford, thank you. Yes, Ed Riefenstahl, the founder and the managing director of ROI Associates, which is a performance improvement, process improvement consulting organization that we've been in business for 30 years and primarily focused on the small business market. And under ROI Associates, 15 years ago, we started the Alternative Board, an organization where we put together business owners from non-competing businesses. It's like a mastermind group, but it also has accountability to help those owners that sit around the table every month advance their organizations. I'm also the Director of Experiential Learning at the Neely School of Business, TCU's Neely School of Business. And there started Neely and Associates, a consulting organization for our MBA students. And over the years, we have done about 150, I've overseen about 150 projects working for fee-paying clients for our MBA students. So I guess one other thing to add before we move on is that within the Alternative Board and working with small business owners, I looked at this the other day, it was hard to believe, have facilitated over 500 different board meetings in the last 15 years of business owners and done over 3,500 one-on-one coaching sessions. So anyway, let's get back to the program. And as Ashford said, there's other words on that page you can catch up on later when we send the slide. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. What you see on the screen now is an overview of what we're going to be talking about over the next hour or so. I'm going to give you some background about the context of this webinar, how it came to be. We're going to talk about where we are, how we got here, and where we're going. One of the underlying themes of this particular webinar series comes from a book called The Fourth Turning. We're going to talk about this in more detail in a few minutes, but The fourth turning and the authors of the fourth turning have developed a context that shows that there are historical cycles in the United States history that repeat themselves over and over again, sequentially throughout our history. And essentially, it's all about, they've stumbled on some pattern recognition that can give us insights into how we got here and where we're going. As you're going to learn as we talk more about this, we are in, and you can feel it now, we're in a new season in United States history. And we have, in our lifetimes, have never experienced anything like this. This is going to require a shift in business strategies. We're going to talk about business strategies that will help you identify threats and opportunities in this environment, how to navigate through it, and even just as important, how to prepare your company for what's coming. And then at the very end, we're going to talk about the objective of this thought leadership series. As I said before, it's a 4-part series. We're going to have the one today, one in May, one in July, one in September. And we're going to delve deeper into the aspects of what you hear today. They give you more tools, techniques, and analytics around how to navigate through this season. So with that, let's go to the next slide. And this is a great quote from Franklin Roosevelt in his inauguration speech. It was actually his second inauguration in 1936. And he said, "There's a mysterious cycle in human events. To some generations, much is given, and to other generations, much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny." And he was already sensing this mysterious cycle that we're going to talk about today. We're going to illuminate. It's not going to be mysterious when we finish this webinar today. But it's also important to note he gave this when the United States was in the middle of a really deep economic crisis called the Great Depression. As you will see when we talk about the methodology of the cycles of history, we are in a crisis right now. It doesn't have the same form as the Great Depression, but it has the same feeling. And much as Franklin Roosevelt and the constellation of generations that were present in the country in 1936, we, as a generation, all of us faced this same moment in time as they did back in the 1930s. So with that, let's go to the next slide. And the next 5 slides are excerpts from a blog I wrote in the last quarter of last year that talk about the times that we live in. And I wanted to just take some time to read through them because it will give us a common context for what we're about to talk about. And you will, as we read through it, you'll see us, you'll see the country, you'll see yourself on the words in these slides. And so with that, we live in what feels like unprecedented times, an overwhelming sense that the nation is coming unglued right before our eyes. Ideological fissures are tearing the country apart, and a hyperpolarization of politics has seemingly no resolution or endpoint in sight. There's a lengthy economic boom undergirded by an unparalleled expansion of technology, but built on a financial house of cards. And we can all feel it. All you have to do today is to get on the social media and you can feel the culture wars raging in intensity. There's ethical and moral frameworks that were inherited from prior generations that are transforming faster than many can assimilate. And a great 2 examples of that is when I was growing up in the 60s, gambling was forbidden. It was a criminal activity, and you could go to jail for gambling. And as we have morphed over the last decade, gambling has gone from being something you would never do under the penalty of going to prison to something now that is being legalized in many states, and even professional sports. The NFL is embracing, and the NBA is embracing professional gambling as a tool for economic generation. Another example of this is cannabis. Back in the 60s, you could go to jail for having just a little bit of marijuana on your person. You could go to jail for years. Over time, as society has shifted, this has now become a multi-billion-dollar business that is quickly being legalized by a lot of states. One of the things that Ed will talk about in the business strategy section of this program is there are tools that you can use to monitor the environment, the macro shifts going on in each environment so you can identify opportunities or threats. You can either ride the wave or develop strategies not to be destroyed by the wave as it rolls through society. So next slide, please. We can all hear, feel, see severe upheaval and dislocation in systems and structures that have held society together. And these dislocations are causing them to come apart in front of our eyes, and it is everywhere we look. We can see it in government, in our political system. We can see our education system falling behind the rest of the world where it once led the world. We see environmental crises wherever we look. The way that we create wealth is coming under scrutiny that it hasn't come under for an entire century. And then innovations in science and medicine are like a huge threshing machine going through society and creating new opportunities, new realities, new structures, and new dangers. And there's not the framework to govern them. They are going this fast, I say, like a huge threshing machine. So with that, let's go to the next slide. And you can see this slide looks much different than the other ones. And I had this pulled out specifically to emphasize this. However, despite what is seemingly all chaos and disorder, it is not. We're about to see that this is a part of a sequence of events that have occurred over and over and over again in U.S. history. It's about pattern recognition. So let's go to the next slide. And so this wraps up the blog that was written. There's a lot of words on that, but it's really important to read this. I said, there's an order and a sequence to events that underlies U.S. history, a pattern that occurs over and over again in the same cycle and can be traced back to the country's earliest histories. Just like the seasonal progression of winter, spring, summer, and fall, history has 4 turnings that occur sequentially in an 80 to 100-year epoch. We are currently at the end of this 100-year era, which culminates in a crisis in which everything comes undone and is remade. And the very last sentence here is maybe the most important. It says, it has all happened before. And while these times are not unprecedented in our history, they are unprecedented for you. And so one of the things that we'll talk about in the next part of this webinar is this new season and what we're moving into and why it feels different and why it is different and why we're not going back to the way that times were before. So let's go to the next slide. This contextual framework comes from a book named The Fourth Turning, and the subtitle is An American Prophecy, What the Cycles of History Tell Us About America's Next Rendezvous with Destiny. It was written by William Strauss and Neil Howe and published in 1997. I read it in probably the first part of 1998, and it recontextualized the framework by which I looked at events that were transpiring in the country. And after I read that, I have been expecting what's going on now for 20 years. Now, I knew the country was going to evolve into a crisis. You don't know the facts, you don't know how it's going to do it, but you're going to know what it feels like. You're going to know the effects of it. You're going to know what's going to make it happen and what's going to happen after that. And so according to the framework that is espoused by this book, and at this point too, I have to say that this is, I was talking to our CEO last week about this. This is not the CFO saying that we're not projecting that we're going to emerge from a crisis into a new reality. But this book has a pattern recognition in it that is worth looking at because it has some good methodologies behind it. And so it's worth looking at to see what might happen going forward. But the book, as we talked about, describes 4 turnings that occur sequentially over and over again, just like the 4 seasons. Each of these turnings lasts 20 to 25 years. And so if you live the length of a normal human life, you're going to see all or parts of each turning or each season. The way it's like, that's the first turning, which is called the high. The second turning is the awakening. The third turning is the unraveling. And the fourth turning, which we are currently in, is called the crisis. It's important to know there's a set point here that we need to work into, and there have been 3 crises before in United States history. It's the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the twin crises of the Great Depression and World War II. So with this next chart just shows, or this next slide shows an example. I'm sorry, just before we go there, the one thing I wanted to emphasize is for everything there is a season. Yeah, go to the next slide, Lisa. For everything there is a season. There's a winter, spring, summer, and fall. And it's important to know what season that we're in. Right now, we're in a crisis, which is winter. But what comes after winter is spring, and spring is going to feel better and easier to us. It's important to realize, though, that to know what season that you're in, not only from a personal standpoint, from a political standpoint, from a business standpoint. You don't, if you're trying to sell suntan lotion in the winter, that's not a good strategy. If you're trying to sell ski jackets in the summer, that's not going to work. So it's important for a business to know what season that you're in. So with that, let's go to the next one. So there is this, and this just shows the 4 turnings in a bar chart form, so you can see that there's a crisis, which the last one was the Great Depression and World War II. It evolves into a high that goes into an awakening, that rolls into an unraveling, and that again, and then the next crisis comes to be. So there's this cyclical turn to each of these. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what happens in each of the turnings. So here you have the 4 turnings in a grid form. And one of the important things to remember is that this is, the book calls the collection of the 4 turnings, it's called the saculum, which includes all 4 turnings. It's about 80 to 100 years. If you read the book, these saculums have happened since the beginning of the country, and they repeat over and over again. So what we're looking at here is the latest saculum, but there's been many more before that. And so what the first one is called the high. And if we look at it, this occurs 1946 to 1964. And this is when the country was emerging from its last big crisis, which was the twin crises of the Great Depression and World War II. And so the government had, in a crisis, eventually what happened in the Great Depression and World War II, the government was highly trusted. It had carried us through 2 back-to-back bone-jarring crises. One was an economic depression, the likes of which we had never seen, then slipping into a very intense international world war. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was highly popular. He was the figure. He had his government carried us through that crisis. The people that lived in that time trusted him, trusted the government, trusted to do what's right. That was a time when government worked. So we emerged from that with a high trust in government and a high trust in institutions. And government was empowered to tackle issues of pressing national concerns, because we as a nation came into consensus a lot easier than we had done in prior periods. And one of the things you'll see as I go through these 4 turnings and the characteristics of each is there's a pendulum also that goes back and forth, that goes from one extreme to the other and then starts back again. It's just underlying nature. And so one of the things that as we emerged from World War II and went into the 50s, we had come from a nation that had gone through economic depression. We had rebuilt the economy to wartime production during the Second World War. And then we turned all that talent and expertise to establishing economic building blocks that would power this nation into becoming the preeminent economic and military superpower on the planet. One of the characteristics for this season is that the concerns of the majority that dominates the focus of national discourse. And so in that particular time, it was the concerns of the white majority. So they determined the focus of society, the moral strictures, what we were going to focus on as a culture. And what happens during this time is, as the slide says, those outside the majoritarian center feel stifled by the conformity. But, you know, for those who who love to read about history, a lot of times the 50s appears to be a pretty quiet decade. But actually, it was a time of enormous vitality. There's a great book called, it's called The 50s by David Halberstam, who is an outstanding writer. And if you read that book, you'll see that the economic building blocks, the cultural building blocks, the societal building blocks were set in place that would set the course for the United States for the next 50 years. There was a lot that happened in the high. And the reason that we're talking about this so much is that this is the next season. After we emerge from this crisis, this is where we're headed. And so it's important for businesses, business owners, CEOs, strategic partners, service providers, to know where we are, what season that we're in, and how to navigate through it. One of the things also, and I grew up in the 60s. In the 60s, I was in the single digits in terms of age, and entertainment and popular culture felt more family friendly. During that time, we watched Father Knows Best, and We Went to Beaver, the Andy Griffith Show, the Dick Van Dyke Show. That was TV entertainment that was that you could feel comfortable with at any moment in time. But as we talk about revolving through the turnings in the seasons, that pendulum also swings. So in an unraveling, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes, the pendulum has swung, and that really represents the current time in 20 years before this, where now you can see at any age, at any time, at any moment, you can see anything on the internet or TV. Things that were forbidden in other times are now available to anyone. So as we talk about the next three seasons, one of the things that's important to know, it's important to know what a season looks like and what you're in. A friend of mine called me, a good friend of mine called me back in the 1990s, and he said, there's this book out called The Seasons of a Man's Life. Have you read it? And I said, no, I haven't. He said, well, you need to read it because these seasons come to all men, and it's better not to stumble into a season not knowing what it's going to bring you, which is, again, one of the purposes of this webinar and this Thought Leader series is to talk about the seasons, where we are, how we got there, and where we're going. So the high lasted from the mid-40s through the mid-60s. It was dominated by the greatest generation, the generation that won World War II and suffered and was growing up in the Great Depression. A great moral conformity, trust in government, a booming economy. And then we go into the next period, which is the awakening. This is the second turning, and it lasts from the mid-60s through the mid-80s. And for those of us that actually lived this, you'll remember that it was a time when the children of the greatest generation began to go to college, and they began to look at the values, the behaviors, the moral structures that their parents had created. They go, we don't like this. We don't like this at all. And so you'll remember on the college campuses, drugs, sex, rock and roll were all prevalent. There was a rebelling nature about this new student generation. It was the hippies. There was a slogan, if you remember, it said, don't trust anyone over 30. And so this generational schism came to be. And that's when men began to grow really long hair. And for the veterans of the World War II generation, who were all equipped with burrs and buzz cuts, for a man to grow long hair was like the antithesis of what they expected from their sons. But one of the things that was even more powerful and even more hurtful was the incredible social turmoil that developed. There was rioting, violent rioting in the cities. There was 3 major assassinations. President Kennedy, followed 5 years later by his brother Robert Kennedy, and followed a short time after that by Martin Luther King, that rocked the nation. There was several students at Kent State University that were killed by the National Guard as the rioting continued. There was an awful war, the Vietnamese War, that skewed society, or there was a schism that developed in society. From that, and then the prior war had been a call to fight an enemy that was trying to take over the free world, versus this was a war that grew out of political ideology, the struggle between the West and the communists. And so there was a section of the country that did not believe in that. One of the trends that developed in the 60s was this is when distrust of the government started to be seeded back into the public ecosystem. And the fact that the Vietnam War, there was, it wasn't a popular war, and there was a feeling among certain segments of the country that the government was lying to us. And as it turned out later with the release of the Pentagon Papers, it turned out that they were, in a lot of cases, lying to us. And that started a disaffection with the government that has continued and flourished into this day. And then that was also built on by Watergate as well. That began to see distrust in the actual presidency itself. And then as we roll into the actual last part of the awakening, that was during the first years of President Reagan's term. At that point in time, the pendulum had swung from the New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt to the political philosophy of the Reagan administration, which was government is too big, it's too ineffective, it's too intrusive in our lives, there's too many regulations, and our tax rates are way too high. And so what will begin there were the trends was to lower the tax rates, and distrust in government and its effectiveness and intent begin to go stronger in our society. So that brings us to the third turning, which is the unraveling. And this is really where I want to start to focus, because most of us have grown up in the third turning, the unraveling, and we have actually lived this. So it's even more ingrained in us. This was in the started in the mid-1980s and ran until 2008. And that 2008 is very intentional, because the authors say that this current crisis was initiated by the financial meltdown in 2008, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. So in an unraveling, what happens, a characteristic of an unraveling, is that the country divides into ideological silos and we yell at each other. And there's no consensus to be had. The ability of government to address issues of pressing national need are weak, because there's no consensus, there's no agreement on what we can do together. There's always a big, long economic boom during an unraveling. And as a point of reference, the unraveling immediately prior to this was in the 1920s. So think about some of the themes of that decade. It was the roaring 20s. The stock market was increasing significantly year by year by year, and increasing the wealth of everybody who was invested in it. It was the speakeasies. It was the flappers. It was a time when a large segment of the public was having a really good time. But if you remember, is that stock market boom in the 1920s was built on a house of cards, money chasing money, and it came to an end very quickly in 1929, and we'll talk about that later. But back to the present time, during an unraveling, there's always technological innovation that makes people feel closer together than ever before. In the 20s, in that unraveling, it was the auto, the car, phone, and radio, bringing people together in ways that they had never imagined. In this current time, it was social media that puts anything that happens into the world available at our fingertips in a moment's notice. Another characteristic of an unraveling is that, unlike the high in the 50s, when the concerns of the majority, concerns and desired majority dominated social discourse, in an unraveling, once again, for everything there is a season, concerns of the minorities come to the surface and are addressed by society. That dominates the focus of our national discourse. But like everything else, that follows a pendulum. It starts out at one, hits the middle, goes to an extreme, and then it will start pulling itself back naturally. And then as just a final attribute, or one of the attributes I said, in an unraveling, individualism peaks. And so, we have the celebrity athletes, the LeBron James, the Tom Brady's, the Tiger Woods, who dominate, the celebrity CEOs, the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musk that dominate that position of society, whereas in a high, in the other side of the extreme, it's the group that is the dominant factor around how we organize ourselves. So what this happens is, and you can see, because we've all lived this, and you know, as an aside, I was out in Los Angeles a couple of years ago with a client who had also lived the fourth turning, and I was telling him about the unraveling and how we had all grown up with the societal structures and the economic structures, and there was mutual agreements between us on how things were going to be. And I said, you know, we have that season has ended, and we're not ever going back to it. And so we have to learn what this new season is going to bring us and how to operate. And I have one more story to tell about my significant other and I, about 17 years ago, had a yellow tabby come out of the woods across the street from our house and adopt us as a family. He was a very strong male. He was about 6 months old, and he came to us in the early spring. And he was a man of the outdoors. He would come in and sleep at night in the house, but every day when we got up, he was waiting at the door to dash outside, and he would spend every day outside and then come in at night to eat and sleep. And one day he came to the door, and there was 8 inches of snow. And he was, what is this? It was wet, it was cold, he couldn't get out. There was nothing he could do. And he was completely flummoxed by it. And then over time, you know, the snow melted and it got a little warmer and he could get back outside. And over time he learned, because he spent 17 years with us before he died about 3 weeks ago, and he got to learn the seasons and that winter would come and winter would go, and what to do in it. But for us, given the fact that crisis is a winter, we're very much like that yellow tabby at the door right now going, gosh, we've never seen this. What do we do? One of the things that I learned from my clients when the pandemic hit last year, which is an element of a crisis, is we don't have a toolbox to deal with this. So once again, one of the objectives of this webinar and the series is to give people context for where we are and the tools of how to navigate through it. So with that, let's go to the crises. This is the fourth turning. This started in 2009. You can see there's not an end to this yet. The 2009, the question mark, question mark, question mark. And we have, as you can see, the first bullet point says institutions are weak and distrusted. So we have come full pendulum swing from the 50s and early 60s when government was trusted. This is a time now when we're completely polarized as a nation and government is weak. This is a time when it's the natural part of the cycle when things are going to be torn down because they have to be remade in order for us to move ahead, to move forward into the next season. It's a time of volatility. It's a time of distrust. Everyone is uncomfortable. The nation feels as if it's at war with each other, and it is. And so, but the good news is, when we navigate through this perilous time, we will, as the second bullet says, this is an era in which America's institutional life is torn down and rebuilt from the ground up, and always in response to a perceived threat to the nation's very survival. Civic authority will revive, cultural expression finds a community purpose, and people begin to locate themselves as members of a larger group. So these are all things that are to come as we start to emerge from the crises. In this last bullet point, which I really find powerful, and this came from the book or some writing from the book, is four turnings have eventually become new founding moments in America's history, refreshing and redefining the national identity. And if we go back to the previous three crises, we can see that when we emerged from the American Revolution, the first democratic nation and government in human history emerged. When we came through the Civil War, we came through reaffirming that all men are created equal as a part of our Constitution. Even though we're still working on that, we reaffirmed that and made it stronger. within our awareness. And then when we came through the twin crises of the Great Depression and World War II, we emerged as the dominant superpower nation in the world. And so we will always emerge from the crisis stronger, but the key is to get through it. And so given this is a new season, we do need new tools, new awareness, new conceptual frameworks for how to navigate through it. So what we're going to talk about next is we're going to talk about two business strategies today, but we're going to go deep in subsequent webinars. We're going to go deeper into what a crisis looks like, what strategies will lead to success, what strategies will identify threats earlier than what we have. And for example, if we're to reemerge more united as a nation, as we have in each of the three crises, this crisis will likely get more intense before it begins to ease into the new season. And so the tools that we talk about now, the communities that we form, the thought groups that we establish to help each other navigate through this are going to be critical. So Ed's about to talk about a wonderful framework for monitoring the environment in 6 different areas for what I call, once again, call the macro trends rolling through society in 6 different areas. And you can either be swamped by these trends or you can ride the wave to them. It's in a crisis, it's even more important to have your threat monitors up and your opportunity monitors up to see because the times are so volatile. One of the we'll talk about that in more detail later. But Ed, would you like to talk about the PESTLE
You bet.
analysis?
Yeah, you bet. Thank you very much, Ashford. So I would like to start for the folks that are with us today to obviously you can see the words on the screen. You each have different experiences. You each have different organizations, but I would like for you to pause and think about what, as you look out in the world right now, do you believe is the most significant external factor that is going to impact your business or your organization? And let's just put that in 12 months. And I'm going to pause for 30 seconds. And if you would, please put your thoughts of what that major external factor is into the chat box, I believe. Okay, so I'm going to start my prepared here. So give everybody 30 seconds. And don't be bashful. Okay, let me stop that. So it doesn't look like did we get anything? And I don't believe we got anything in the chat box. So let's do this. Focus out 3 years. Same question. And if you had written something down and not put it in the chat box for the next 12 months, think about the next 3 years. It may be the same thing that you had jotted down and or put in the chat box, or it could be something completely different. So let me take another 30 seconds for you to do that. Okay. Thank you to all who shared what is on your mind. So we're going to talk about a framework, and Ashford gave you the patterns that are discussed in the fourth turning. So we're going to talk about an analysis that has a framework that has the acronym PESTLE. And as you can see, the P stands for political, the E economic, S societal, T technological, L legal, and the other E is environmental. And so as we look at PESTLE, this slide is intended to just give you the important notion that none of these categories of the PESTLE framework, the trends that are in them necessarily operate in isolation, that they often also impact other trends that are within the PESTLE framework. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so as Ashford teed up, we're looking at a macro overview. So as you look within PESTLE, you have these major subcategories for each of the PESTLE framework. What we're going to do now is dig a little deeper. And on the next slide, it's going to be difficult to see everything, but you're going to get these in the materials that'll be sent to everybody. And I'll just pick one or two as an example. So let's look at legal first. Okay, so what we've done in putting these prompts together for you, we've pulled together a series of trends that are happening right now. And within legal, as you look at legal as well as the others, not all of these are probably going to impact you. And those that do you feel will impact you, some will be more impactful than others. So, in legal, one of the things that jump out for us at ROI Associates is what we've all been living through with COVID. The clients that we have, what is going to happen as far as legal liability? Excuse me, as there are new laws put in place to protect employees and maybe even protect independent contractors. DEI. Big, in the last 12 months, again, diversity, equity, and inclusion. As your business gets larger, this is also going to become something more important to you. And we hope everybody on the webinar today is focused on growing, and in doing so, again, growing the people that help you succeed. Let's take a look at economic also, just for a second. So, as I look at this, obviously we are all anticipating that there's probably going to be some tax increases coming with the new administration. There is very likely going to be an increase in the minimum wage. The K recovery, before the stimulus package, everybody was looking at a K recovery, depending upon how you look at it, depending upon who you sell to, your services or your products. That K recovery is going to have an impact on your business. Let's see. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to quickly go over. What we wanted to do today was give you something that is practical and usable for you in your small business. So Ashford gave us, okay, here's the patterns. We just quickly went over some trends and trend areas, and we're going to give you those as prompts. But what does that mean? What do I do with this stuff? So, in taking PESTLE as how you look at the world, look at the subcategories of trends in them, you need to look at. Let's just say start out with 3 to 5, and let's do 5 for the example we're going to walk through. So if we look at these 5 and we've written out, here's the trend, here is the potential impact as we see it from our experience, from the subject matter experts we talk to. And of the 5, the one that has the greatest impact that you and your people believe is the greatest, you're going to give that a 10. For the other 4, you're going to look at those. and say, well, hey, obviously this is the most impactful. This is a 10. how are the others relative to the one that is most impactful that you've given a 10? So if you feel that one is like half impactful, you're going to give it a 5, okay? If you feel it's like, let's say, I'm going to give it a 2. But you take care of the 5, starting with the one that is the most impactful, you give it a 10. That's great. Well, what about the probability next? So now what we need to do is look at the 5. And again, in isolation, working by yourself or with your team or with your subject matter expert, with your advisory board, your board of directors, whatever, come up with how probable or likely you feel that this is going to actually be something that does impact the business. Okay, so we've done that. And well, on the probability front, we're also going to give it some numerical scoring. And if you feel that this is 100% probable, you're going to give it a 10. Okay, if you feel it's 50% probable, you're going to give it a 5. So you'll do that for each of the 5 as you work through this. And now what we're going to do is multiply the probability times the impact. And we're going to come up with a number. And this is going to now direct our limited resource, which is time, as to how can we plan and put in place actions and resources to build these into our plans and into our strategies. So as I said, you now have an order in which to attack these. So as you attack them, you're going to look at your people. You're going to look at where you would make investments, right? People, process, technologies. Are you going to change your business model? Are you even going to look at changing your organizational structure? So these are some of the things that you'll be looking at. How do you take into account actions to managing these trends? Okay, next slide, please. Or next, yeah, good. So as you do this, you need to have somebody who's responsible, right? Somebody who owns it. So whatever the actions you are taking, and these trends can be favorable or unfavorable, right? So, but you're going to start with the one with the highest probability and the highest impact for you. And you are going to assign someone responsible. You're going to look at, given your cash, given what's in the bank, what access to capital, what can you afford? What can you afford, right, to implement these actions? Whatever your plans have been, as you look at these trends, you're now going to go back and reassess the allocation of time for the people impacted in your organization or the external folks you may be working with. And then also how much is it going to cost? So, okay, next slide. Okay, next one, please. Okay, to walk you through an example real quickly. So ROI Associates, what we did, looked at Pestle, and we saw in 4 of the 6 categories in the framework, we identified 4 trends that were on that earlier slide you saw that you couldn't read until I guess Lisa had pulled up the legal and the economic. And again, you are going to get that. So next slide, please. So in bold is what was on the previous page. So I'm going to go through these very quickly. And under economic, we felt that more people are looking to have more than ever diverse income streams. And even small business owners are probably looking, right, to have diverse income streams. So for us, this represents we feel opportunities to partner with maybe an individual who has a full-time position or another organization where we can expand the opportunity that we bring to or the value we bring to our clients. On the social side, you've got the senior tsunami happening. You know, between, was it 1976 and 85, there was an increase of 265% of small business formation in this country. Now, obviously, how many of those seniors are still in their business? And I don't know, but there's obviously quite a few. They are many thinking, okay, am I going to sell this? And is this my exit? So there's opportunities there to help organizations work on their processes and help them increase with that the value of the organization. So again, that was how, here's the trend, maybe here's where we can find a niche to serve. On the technology front, with technology making it easier to start businesses, more people are starting businesses, right? And maybe we want to take a look at having one of our business owner boards, again, of non-competing owners, mastermind group with accountabilities, and look at a startup only group and see if we can monetize that. On the environmental front, I think we all remember a few weeks ago what happened to us, right? And most people believe this is going to continue into the future, these weather disruptions. So for us, as we looked at that macro trend, it was, we're building a strategic retreat in New Mexico for business owners to take their teams to have strategic planning sessions. So, okay, so what's the impact? Well, as we launch this and beyond the launch, with these weather disruptions, there's going to be cancellations, and that's going to hit the bottom line from what we forecast in our revenue and in our cash flow. So, as you look probability and impact, we went through that just as I took you through the exercise before, and we ended up with the environmental, that weather disruption impacting our projected forecasted revenue from the strategic retreat at Casa Patron, having a 70% probability, and that had the highest impact. We gave that a 10, and then again, relative to that of a 10, we gauged the impact. And so after multiplying 7 times 10, we had 70. The second highest one was the boomers. And is there something that we could be doing to help boomers increase the value of their business as they go forward and want to maximize, optimize their take-home pay? So again, that was the second highest one. Next slide, please. Okay, great. We've gone through this exercise. We've made it visible. So if you're working alone, you're taking it out of your head, you're writing this down so it becomes clearer to you. If you're working with a team, everybody can see the information and question it and have a better understanding. So for us, getting back to the weather-driven cancellations, may seem minor, but we thought, we want to make sure about a specific cancellation clause we want to put in the contract for either use of the facility or facilitation. And so that was going, because if not, what we put forward was that clause would be, if they don't reschedule the group, whoever it is, within 6 months, they will lose their deposit. So that's being assigned to the COO in the organization. When we look again at investments, well, we're going to have to go use probably our attorney, pretty good with contracts, and we've assigned a date and how much we think it's going to cost. That alone means the COO is going to take up some time, which is going to take away from some other time. We're putting some money out that we weren't anticipating. It affects our plans, and we need to go back and rethink that. On the managing action for the acceleration of the baby boomers, and just looking, it's going to be a buyer's market out there, folks. If you're a business owner, it's going to be a buyer's market. But how can we help businesses get optimal valuation? How can they see us as a trusted resource in that area? Obviously, we can partner with others, but maybe we might want to have some certification, such as the Exit Planning Institute. Can assign it to somebody. In this example, okay, Ed, you're the CEO. You go ahead and get that certification. It's going to cost about $5,000, and we're doing it July through October. Same thing as before. We go in. What does that mean to our plans that we had for that particular quarter or for the year or whatever period? We make adjustments, and also impacts our forecasted expenses and budget. So again, what you have here is a high-level framework, PESTLE. You now, within that framework, you have various trends going on. We're going to send you that slide that has those prompts, as well as the next slide, that these are very excellent sources for you to review, to think about how they impact your business. They'll all fit into that pestle. And then you have now a way to prioritize how you're going to deal with those trends that you and your people feel are going to be most impactful and highly probable. And you have a way to efficiently deal with those. So Ashford, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Ed. And one of the things we've seen is that the pestle analysis is a very powerful way to monitor the external environment for these type of developments that can impact our business positively or negatively. It's important to marry that with the concept of the seasons. We're in a crisis. Pestle analysis is always important, probably even more so now because of the volatility of the environment with which we find ourselves. And I'd like to add, we're gonna wrap up this section with just a quick look at corporate resource allocation. One of the things that Ed was talking about, as you go through and you would do the pestle analysis and you prioritize what has the most probability and the highest impact, and you allocate resources to address that. And one of the things that hit me, especially during the pandemic, and it was a lesson that was brought home to all of us. And during the last economic crisis in 2008, when we had that meltdown in the housing market that caused then a huge crisis in the debt market, which then had it rolled over into an economic crisis for almost all of us. I happened to have the privilege of working with a man. I was reporting to him he was the finance chairman on our board of directors for an organization I was working with. He was one of the most brilliant investment professionals, as most brilliant I've ever worked with. And his firm, which is widely known as a very shrewd investment firm, was actually betting against the housing market. And so when it crashed, they made a ton of money. They had made a ton. They were actually mentioned, the firm was actually mentioned in Michael Lewis's book, The Big Short, as one of the 4 groups that was standing outside of the economy to look at what was going on and not buying into the prevailing wisdom of housing prices are just going to keep going up and up. As a result, they made a lot of money. And that taught me a lesson how to stand outside the current methodology of business and see where the holes are. And so with that, when the pandemic hit in last year, in business before the PPP loans could be distributed, there was a couple of months, businesses started started closing their doors or laying off people with an amazing rapidity because their liquidity reserves were very thin. And a friend of mine who's in the marketing world, marketing, branding, license, who has no concept of financials, asked me a very telling question. He said, well, if us as individuals, as parents, as family members, it's financial best practice to have 6 months of savings in case there's something, a financial dislocation, a loss of a job, something that we need to have reserves for 6 months to pay our bills. Why aren't corporations held to the same standard? And well, that's interesting. That's an interesting point. And it goes further. About that time, I listened to a podcast that was hosted by this man in DC, and it was May, right as the pandemic panic was really setting in. And he brought in 3 local business owners from the DC area to talk about how they were managing their businesses during this unprecedented time. And there was a guy who owned 3 restaurants in the DC area. And he, as we all know, restaurants were one of the first businesses to start closing and experience the blunt of the economic downturn the quickest. And he said that he owned 3 restaurants in the area. And he had been able to pay his 140 employees full wages for 14 straight weeks until the PPP loans started coming in. And he was saying that, this is the 3rd generation we're the third generation in our family to have this business. We've been building our liquidity for years against something like this happening, because you can build value in a business, but if you're not prepared for these big tsunamis that roll through society from time to time, all that value building you've done for years or decades just evaporates so quickly. And so that got me to thinking, and this segment here is about corporate resource allocation. And one of the things that we're taught in capitalism, and especially in my end of the business, you know, our clients are always focused on year-over-year revenue growth. We've got to grow revenue 25% year-over-year. We've got to increase EBITDA 40% year-over-year. We've got to, so we can build a high valuation to get 8x to sell to private equity group. But what that doesn't take into account is, if you don't have enough liquidity to weather a crisis, you don't have the sustainable foundation. All that work can be undone by, this will not be the last pandemic-like event to hit this economy. And so we need to reintroduce the concept of liquidity back into our corporate vernacular. Once again, standing outside, like the guy did whose firm stood outside the economy and said, this housing market won't continue. There are things that we need to consider. So these next slides talk about what I call corporate resource allocation. This first slide, it's a quadrant, and it has 4 different parts. At the upper left are current operations. The second is people. The one in the lower left is innovation and R&D, and the fourth one is liquidity. And that blue square there is the amount of resources that a company is investing in any one of those quadrants at a given time. And so it can be money, corporate focus, corporate energy, and to look at to invest in this. And so this represents that mythical group where it's equilibrium, when they're investing a certain amount of resource allocation in each segment at the same time. And so with that, let's go to the next slide. There's 3 more slides after this. This is a group that they're expanding current markets. So you can see that their resource allocation is going heavily into current operations and investing in their people, because that's where their market is right now. That's where they're making the most money. They're not investing a lot in innovation and R&D, and they're investing most of their profit back into current operations and people. Let's go to this next slide. This is what I call the harvesting slide, and this is the company. This could be akin to the companies that make Lysol and that make Clorox, and what had been commodities before, but the demand has grown very, very high for them given the current circumstances. They're investing a lot in current operations, but they're also harvesting. They're building liquidity because they're making a lot of money from their current operations. However, because they're not investing much in innovations and R&D and people, they may be leaving themselves vulnerable to when these dynamics within seasons shift. So it's important to know, when you're in a harvesting mode and you're making a lot of money, if this shifts, when this shifts, are you going to have enough liquidity and enough investment in the various quadrants to make the pivot, to successfully make the pivot? And I have a story of a company I was talking to a couple of months ago that made ventilators, 20 years old. In 2018, they entered bankruptcy. In 2019, they were trying to emerge, but didn't think they could. And also in the pandemic hit. And then they got a one order that was tens of millions of dollars that has consumed their company in trying to meet the demands of it. But they also know there's a cliff coming. This harvesting they're experiencing is going to require a pivot. So once again, looking at what you're investing in, where you're allocating your resources to, what your liquidity looks like. And then the final slide is actually another company, another profile. And I work with a lot of companies like this, especially like in the SaaS technology area, where you're investing a lot in innovation. You've got a small footprint in current operations because the innovation you're investing in is not yet market ready. You've got some people and you have very little liquidity, which all that investment in innovation and R&D and all that valuation that you're building, if you don't have the liquidity to weather some crises, it can all come out from under you. And so this is, once again, knowing where you are, knowing the current environments, knowing how you're investing your resources, and being able to pivot when needed. It's more important than ever before. And before we go on, I'm going to leave you with this one last story that talks about how things can escalate quickly. So we have the pandemic that we saw coming from Asia and then Europe, but did very little to prepare for. It hit us. It had a profound impact on our economy. And, it caused a huge economic depression in certain sectors of our economy, which we're dealing with. But then, and referred to back something that Ed talked about, then in Texas, we have an extreme storm caused by the polar vortex that causes us to have to partially shut down the energy grid for long periods of time. But the cautionary tale is not that. The cautionary tale is that there's the ERCOT, the Electricity Reliability or the Energy Reliability Council of Texas, said that the Monday that the storm hit, the second of the storm, they had to start turning off large swaths of the grid in order to preserve it. They were minutes away from the grid collapsing. They said if the grid itself had collapsed, it would take weeks or months to fully put it back online. So to show how things can pancake sometimes, pandemic, economic collapse in huge parts of the economy, if Texas had gone offline, it would not only had a profound impact on Texas, but the rest of the nation. That might have been the straw that tipped us into a much deeper version of this economic downturn that we are having. And so once again, the point of this is just to be aware of your environment, be aware of your liquidity, monitor things very carefully, be on top of things. So with that, we're going to go into the close of this to talk about a little bit about the Thought Leadership Series.
Hey, Ashford?
Yes, sir.
Can I jump in on one thing?
Absolutely.
I saw while you were giving the focus on resource allocation, and that will change based on, again, your plans and how you look forward. I saw Amanda had in the chat a question, give me some examples, and I don't know if we gave enough, but just real quickly, we have a roofing client that has said, because of the weather, I'm going to open an office in Houston, and I'm going to open an office in Louisiana. And just another business owner looking forward and saying, with China, there's going to continue to be bad stuff. And she has high-end mirrors that go into high-end hotels. And she knows that she has got to find other sources for that product because she's anticipating continuing issues with our relationship with China. So another firm in the information technologies group that used to be all project-based, they're saying because of technology, I'm going to move to managed services and have a recurring revenue. So anyway, I hope those are some additional examples, Amanda, to see how some business owners were looking ahead, whether they use pestle or not, they were planning for a change of things in the future.
Thanks, again. Thanks, Amanda, for raising it. We're getting a lot of great questions within the chat and Q&A. And I wanted to spend just about the next 3 minutes talking about what we want to accomplish with this Thought Leadership Series. We spent a lot of time today talking about the context, with the provision, that we have pattern recognition in this book that doesn't, what's past is not prologue. It may not work out that way this time. This is, like I say, it's not VCFO saying this is what's going to happen. But this is something worth monitoring to see if what we think is coming is and to prepare for it. And so, as I said, we spent a lot of time in this one downloading information to you. The next 3 of these, we want to make more highly interactive. We're going to delve deeper into the crisis. We're going to talk about what works and what doesn't, what to avoid, what not. We're going to bring subject matter expert in to tell you about analytics and techniques and technology that can help you, training that can help you navigate through this and prepare for the high, which we saw is the era of building. We want to help you identify the most advantageous markets, the type of liquidity that you need, and how to position your company to identify opportunities and threats, and how to train your management team, how to deal with this new environment. So with that, the next slide, we can see that we do have 3 other ones coming up. One the week of May 10th, the week of July 19th, and the week of September 13th. We'll identify specific dates for those shortly. We hope you'll join us because the whole point of this is to create a thought leader series where you're engaging in dialogue and interaction with thought leaders about your own particular circumstances, your thoughts, your instincts, your insights. We haven't had a chance to do that much during this webinar just due to the fact that there's so much information to be conveyed. We're going to be following up with blogs. As situation evolves, we'll send you emails, there'll be blogs. We will also, there's going to be something called we may have pop-up 30-minute webinars. And the genesis for that is, and this is something I didn't cover during my first section, is that in each crisis, there is a catalyst that signals that this crisis is going to become more serious. And in the Revolutionary War, it was the Battle of Bunker Hill, where the tensions between the English and the colonies had got to a point where the crisis became violent. We launched into the Revolutionary War. During the Civil War, it was John Brown's raid on the ferry, and then it was the election of Lincoln, which caused the South to succeed, and then Sumner Hill, and then that became hot. In the third crisis, the Great Depression, was Black Friday. Those were the catalysts that signaled, gosh, the crisis is moving to a different phase. Only history will know, but one of the things that could have been signaling this crisis moving to a deeper phase was the insurrection at the Capitol. And so had this series been running at the time, we would immediately put on a 30-minute webinar talking about that, the implications, what we need to do, and how that happens. So you may see us trigger something between now and in the next 4 or 5 months that we want you to know this is an element of what we're experiencing. And so with that, we do have some questions. We have just a few minutes left. One of the things that I'm really pleasantly surprised about is that there are so many questions, both in Q&A and chat. One of the things that we'll do, we're not going to have time to answer all of them today, but we're going to follow up with the questions and the answers to this group. And I've seen several of them that actually want to incorporate into the next webinar. You guys are extremely insightful. A lot of gist for a lot of discussion going forward. So with that, Lisa, could you, maybe Ed and I could take a couple of questions of piece. Could you read some of these?
Sure. Hi, I'm Lisa Beebe. I'm with the VCFO. One question is for you, Ashford. Given the crisis, the state of the economy, and the volatility of our current environment, what would you advise CEOs and business owners to be aware of that we are not watching right now?
Oh, that's a really good question. This brings up for me, I would say that, and I was harping on liquidity and the corporate resource allocation because that's what I see a lot of companies that didn't have enough liquidity to weather this crisis, or it put them at such extreme, they had to do extreme things, is that what's your balance sheet? What's your balance sheet? I know a lot of business owners that monitor their income statement very carefully each month, but they very rarely do the same type of rigorous analysis on your balance sheet. What are your assets? Look at the liquidity of your assets. Cash is instant liquidity. Receivables have a certain level of liquidity. Other assets have different levels of liquidity, but you've got to match that up versus the maturity of your liabilities. When are your liabilities maturing? And when are your assets maturing? You've got to match up those revenue streams. If there's not enough focus on the balance sheet or on cash flow. So look at your balance sheet with the same rigor that you do your income statement. And I'll finish with one example. One of the first clients I ever had in the consulting field, he had just had his best month ever, made a ton of money, and he turned to me and said, "Why? If I've made all this money in this month, how come I can't pay my vendors on time?" And I said, "Have you ever looked at your cash flow statement to see?" And we went there, and he had his answer. So It's a lot more than just income statement. What's your balance sheet?
Okay, well, I have a question for Ed. Is the tool you showed us today part of what I'm hearing about the entrepreneurial operating system, EOS, in the book Traction?
Okay. No, but it fits, it very much fits into that. It's not specifically addressed in that. And so what we wanted to provide was something we use with our consulting clients as, you look at the EOS or the entrepreneurial operating system as we work with different people and say, okay, now here's a tool that is not identified there that may be helpful for you to help you plan 3 years out, help you plan 1 year out, help you plan a quarter out.
Thank you. So I have one more for each of you. Ashford, in this webinar, there is significant emphasis on the changes in the economy and culture as we move from one season to the next. Are there other aspects of these historical cycles of which we should be aware?
Yes, there's one of the things we haven't been able to do. We haven't been able to do justice to the wisdom and the writings of the foreturning. This has been just the briefest of cliff notes that we could do. There is another aspect I didn't get a chance to talk about, and we may talk about in the future. These two authors, before they wrote the fourth turning, and they talked about the cycles of American history, they wrote a book together called Generations. And they were looking for what are the characteristics that make a generation, what defines one. And in their research, they actually identified the same pattern as there's 4 generational archetypes that repeat themselves sequentially over time and that overlay on the 4 turnings. And I'm just for example, there's always, there's a generational archetype called the prophets. And it's the Prophets, like the biblical prophets that lead the nation during a time of crisis. And this generation has the ability to hold the nation together while it's working through the crisis so it doesn't split apart. And so there's no, it's no accident under this conceptual framework that George Washington, the founding fathers, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt were leading the nation during that time because they had the ability to hold it together so it didn't split apart. And so what happens after the prophets pass, that they typically age out after the crisis, and a new generational archetype called, that in this case is the millennials, that will take power. And the millennials are the original latchkey kids. They were the first generation to come home, and both their parents were working. They had to fend for themselves. And they are trained from childhood on how to pick up the pieces and go forward, which will be a key skill during this time. So each generation, whatever generation you find yourself in, you're going to play a key part into what's coming next. And it's important to know what your generational role is going to be. Every generation is going to have an important part going forward.
Well, that actually is a great segue into this last question for Ed. And speaking of generations, Ed, you mentioned the senior tsunami. What is that?
Well, it is what I referenced earlier, which is there are so many baby boomers that started businesses. And what is happening, they have to, if they're still in business, what are they going to do? Are they going to let the business die? Or do they have a succession plan that may include family? Or do they need to look elsewhere for a third party, whether it's private equity, a competitor, a complementary type of strategic buyer? So what's happening is that the ratio of businesses, because of this tsunami of seniors, the ratio of businesses going on the market, given the historical number of businesses that have been sold, and even if you take the number that is documented and multiply it times 2, you get a ratio of 1 to 10. So in essence, it's a more competitive environment. If you're looking to sell to a third party, you need to really have your you-know-what together. Having a great balance sheet is important. Having processes and protocols that you're using and living by that can be easily handed off or integrated with the prospective buyer will help you get a higher multiple. So anyway, that's where any owners need to be thinking about, I'm not going to live forever, and therefore I need to look to trusted advisors to help them prepare so they can optimize or be more competitive in that buyer's market.
Great. Listen, thank you so much. Lisa, Heather, thank you also. Deb for being the backbone of this team. We want to thank you all for your participation this afternoon. You've been great. There's a ton of great questions. I can't wait to dive into all of them and start sending you guys out answers to this. And actually, a lot of your questions will be form the discussion points for the next few webinars. Thank you again very much, and we will see you the week of May 10th. Thanks all.
Thank you. Thank you, VCFO marketing team.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Ed. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ashford.